Many in England and outside of Ireland may be unaware that it was not just the IRA who were waging a guerrilla war in the province of Ulster. There were opposing, pro-British, Protestant factions. Two of the most famous and well-known groups which still exist to this day are the Ulster Defence Association and the Ulster Volunteer Force, the UDA and UVF respectively. The UDA, formed in 1971 as the Troubles reached ever new dizzying heights in Northern Ireland, was a self-defence paramilitary group. Its purpose? To protect the Protestants of Northern Ireland and their culture. To do this, it undertook large-scale uniform patrols of Catholic districts, armed with batons. Headquartered in Belfast, its armed wing was known as the Ulster Freedom Fighters, the UFF. It undertook its armed operations separately from its other activities to avoid being outlawed by the British government. At its peak, the organisation had 40,000 members on its books. Founded by Charles Harding Smith, a former British Army officer, the group was responsible for the killings of over 400 people, predominantly Catholics, with its usual modus operandi being retaliation attacks on Catholics after attacks on Protestant civilians. The UFF was a proscribed terrorist organisation in 1973, but the UDA was not proscribed until 1992. Needless to say, the UDA remains active despite having declared a ceasefire in 1994 and stopping armed operations in 2007. Like the UVF, it remains active in organised crime. Like most paramilitaries in Northern Ireland, loyalist and republican, the UDA did have a political ideology which was largely guided by its loyalist Protestant cause. It briefly flirted with Ulster nationalism, which was briefly popular in some unionist circles in the 1970s and 80s. As the name suggests, the concept revolved around Northern Ireland gaining independence from the UK and essentially becoming a Protestant ethnostate, which would have perhaps scarily reached genocidal levels, with Catholics expelled to the south and an apartheid-like state on the island of Ireland in the most extreme renditions of this concept. In 1994, the UDA released their Doomsday Plan, which you can see a map of here. Extreme loyalists, anticipating a British withdrawal from Northern Ireland, would carve out a Protestant state in Ulster. Key areas to be included would inevitably be County Antrim Down, the two counties in Northern Ireland with Protestant majorities. Yet it would extend to the northwest, encompassing Derry or Londonderry. Despite having an overwhelmingly Catholic majority, the UDA anticipated the incorporation of Derry into their state. Perhaps this has more to do with the cultural and historical significance of this city rather than its demographics. Derry, or Londonderry, was built as an English colonial outpost. It gets its full official name from the London Guilds, who funded the city. One of the finest walled cities in Europe, Derry was originally a Protestant city that came under siege by the Jacobite forces, the forces loyal to King James II, in 1688. The siege was fought by 13 apprentices shut the gates to the city, giving birth to the fraternal society, the Apprentice Boys of Derry. The UDA also proposed an enclave around Enniskillen in the southwest. Again, largely Catholic, but a sizable Protestant majority of over 30%, and historically significant where the Battle of Newtown Butler took place in 1689 during the Williamite War in Ireland. A corridor to Omagh and Strabane was also proposed. Little is known about this plan, but its creators had deeply sinister intentions. Considering 2 to 3 counties of Northern Ireland to be lost, the UDA sought to create a Protestant ethnostate, an ethnic homeland for Protestants in Ulster. The Catholics who found themselves living within the borders of this new ethnostate would face a very bleak future. They were to be expelled, nullified, or interned. Nullified, referencing killed. The plan was released just a year before the Srebrenica massacre and the wider breakup of Yugoslavia, with ethnic cleansing and genocide taking place in the Balkans. Could we have seen a Yugoslavia-like situation in the British Isles? In many ways, we already have one. The Troubles was remarkably similar to the ethnic strife in the Balkans, at a lower, more prolonged intensity. The sectarian nature of the political system in Ulster is also similar to Bosnia, where Muslims and Orthodox Serbs have separate political representation. The Catholics who would not have been killed in this plan would have been sent south and west of the border into the Republic. Perhaps many would have simply fled and become refugees. The United States would have probably been willing to take in thousands of Irish given the large and influential Irish community in the United States. Those who did not flee or were forced to leave would have been perhaps forced into H-blocks or concentration camps. John Adair was born in October 1963 in loyalist West Belfast, not far from the Shankill Road. I visited Belfast recently, spending a large part of my time in and around the Shankill. It remains a strongly working class, loyalist area, a Protestant enclave in the largely Catholic west of Belfast. The youngest of 7 children, his parents were not involved in loyalist activities. In fact, his father maintained close friendships with Irish nationalists in the New Lodge area of West Belfast in which they lived. His father appeared to have something of an interest in pigeons, like some other figures discussed on this channel. Despite Johnny's parents being strict and sending him to Sunday school every week, the young Adair was rebellious and got involved in petty crime and began to associate with affiliates of the National Front, an extremely racist neo-Nazi organisation in Britain, which perhaps unsurprisingly was supportive of the status quo in Northern Ireland. Adair formed a skinhead street gang. Adair is perhaps noteworthy because, as well as being an Ulster loyalist, he had strongly far-right tendencies. He and his friends launched violent attacks on anti-racist fans of the Specials and the Beat when the two bands played at the Ulster Hall, a theatre in Belfast, with Adair and his associates performing Nazi salutes. In retaliation, Adair was assaulted by Irish Republicans whilst attending a UB40 concert. Adair and his gang became ever more brazen when he and 200 other skinheads, nicknamed the Glue Sniffers Gang, descended on Belfast City Hall intent on rioting against C&D demonstrators. This action was not approved by the UDA, who ruled over the Protestant communities they represented with something of an iron fist. As a consequence of this, and Adair also assaulted an elderly woman, Adair was threatened with kneecapping by the UDA, while South Belfast Brigadier John McMichael declared he wanted Johnny and his gang run out of town. Narrowly avoiding being kneecapped, Adair was given the option of joining the Ulster Young Militants, the UDA's youth wing, deemed too immature and too much of a liability to join the main UDA. He would eventually join the UDA itself, taking part in armed operations as part of the UVF. He had no less than 15 attempts on his life. One of these attempts, by the IRA, on a fish and chip shop, resulted in the deaths of 9 people, though Adair escaped. In 1995, Adair would become the first person in the province's history to be charged with directing terrorism. Yet despite his terrorist background, it is suspected that the British Army were involved in collusion, with Adair being invited to dinner with the intelligence corps. Adair was often passed on information about Republicans by sympathisers within the army. Adair was incarcerated until September 1999 in the infamous Maze prison before being released. He would return to the Shankill where in August 2000 he organised a Loyalist Day of Culture. During the same month, he claimed to have been attacked by a pipe bomb from the IRA. The Day of Culture, on the 19th of August, featured marching bands and a loyalist show of strength from the West Belfast Brigade. In terms of the context, during this period, the UDA had been in conflict with other loyalist groups, like the Loyalist Volunteer Force, known as the LVF, and the Ulster Volunteer Force, the UVF. When the final band passed a Rex bar on the Shankill Road, an LVF banner was unfurled. This was enough to precipitate an explosive burst of violence. Gunmen attacked the Rex bar, firing about 11 shots into the pub. The pub's customers barricaded themselves inside to stop the gunmen storming the bar, which they had been attempting to do. The attackers, unable to access the pubgoers, turned on bystanders outside. The sight of loyalists attacking other loyalists must have been one sight, but it was an all too common feature of life in some loyalist circles during the dark days of the early 2000s. Children had to be escorted to and from school under the watchful eye of armed police due to fears they would be targeted by rival loyalists. The British government briefly withdrew the ceasefire status of the UDA, which had been in place since 1994. Adair was intent on cleansing the area of UVF members, who had their homes ransacked, including the home of the then leader of the UVF, Gusty Spence. In retaliation, 2 of Adair's allies were murdered, Jackie Coulter and Bobby Mahood. In light of the violence, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Peter Mandelson, demanded Adair's early release to be revoked, and so he was thrown back in prison, this time in Maghabrook. He was released in 2002. From this moment onwards, the feud between loyalists only continued. He was intent on forging closer ties with the LVF, which was founded in 1996 by Billy Wright, a paramilitary leader and Protestant preacher who was murdered the following year in 1997. Commanded by Mark Swinger Fulton after Wright's death, the two men got on well. Yet those in the UDA believed it was an attempt by Adair to take the throne he believed which was his in the UDA leadership. The LVF were heavily involved in drug dealing, which many in the UDA disliked. If you're a long-standing viewer of the channel, you may recall in the Blundell video, we discussed how there were fears of a mini-cab war in the East London area in the 1970s. Well, in Belfast in the early to mid-2000s, that's exactly what happened. The so-called Belfast taxi wars were part of this wider loyalist feud. The taxis in Belfast have a colourful history as far as their involvement with loyalist groups go, as you can see in this recent video.
You're fucking lucky I'm not fucking taking your fucking knees out down this fucking car park, son. I'm fucking telling you now, because that's a fucking mood I'm in. Believe me, now I'm telling you. See what happens in this car? See if I hear anybody fucking talking about it, mate. I will take your fucking head off. Do you fucking hear me?
Yeah, mate.
Right?
Yes.
This is the fucking last of it, son. You fucking do what you do. You make up what you need to fucking make up quickly. You work your fucking dad off. I'm telling you, see you next time I come back, I'm taking your fucking legs off. Only because that's my fucking mate. And only he is my mate, I will be taking your legs off. That's it. Finishes here. I promise you. That's it over and done with. I'm not coming back near you. You fucking make improvements.
Let's get the fuck out of here, man. I didn't know fucking. Let's get the fuck out of here, man.
Neil, I'm sorry. I didn't put you in that position.
You didn't fucking tell me that, mate, but fuck me, I'm shaking like a leaf here, mate.
I'm sorry.
Meanwhile, concerns have also been raised that loyalist groups are using taxis to ferry drugs and cash across Belfast. Back in the early 2000s, cab offices came under fire from rival loyalists, usually in an area termed the Greatest Shankill. The main cab war centred over a cab firm owned by Jackie Mahood, a former UVF man who went out to co-found the LVF with Billy Wright before the latter was murdered the following year. Mahood's brother Bobby was murdered during the UVF-UDA feud. Back to Adair, in late September of 2002, he was summoned to Sandy Row in loyalist South Belfast. He was to meet other members of the UDA's inner council. Fearing an ambush, Adair had his allies smuggle a pistol into the meeting for him. During the meeting, there was a showdown between Adair and Jim Gray. Gray was the head of the UDA in East Belfast, and Adair's nemesis, who was shot in the face by Adair's supporters some months earlier. Adair had caused friction in the ranks of the UDA by spreading false rumours that Gray was to be stood down from his role in the UDA leadership as part of a daring attempt to take full control of the UDA for himself. To add further insult to injury, Adair had falsely said to the relatives of Stephen Warnock that Gray had played a part in his death. Warnock was an LVF leader. In reality, he had been killed by a Red Hand Commando gunman after refusing to pay a drugs debt. It was this false allegation which had got Gray shot. It was perhaps unsurprising then that 5 days after the showdown, the rogue loyalist found himself expelled from the UDA on the grounds of treason. Undeterred, he attempted to create his own splinter group, the West Belfast UDA, claiming in the aftermath of the feud it was business as usual. Yet it was anything but. Adair quickly found himself back in jail in January 2003 for violating the terms of his parole for engaging in unlawful activity. Just a month after being put back in prison, in February 2003, John Gregg was shot dead in a taxi, having just arrived back in Northern Ireland after he had crossed the Irish Sea to visit a Rangers game in Glasgow. His UDA associate Robert Carson died alongside him. Gregg was widely believed to have been responsible for organising the bulk of attempts on Adair's life. Predictably, as you've probably guessed by this point, chaos ensued. Around 30 loyal Adair supporters were forced to flee the Shankill at gunpoint. In fact, they were essentially run out of Northern Ireland altogether, heading into exile in Scotland. Some of them found safety in Bolton, Greater Manchester. The group, which included Adair's wife, 2 children and several trusted associates, became known as the Bolton Wanderers. They were accommodated in Manchester by neo-Nazis they had forged ties with, a group called Combat 18, or C18, which is a proscribed organisation in the UK. While still in prison, in April 2003, gunmen believed to be from the North Belfast UDA attacked the new home of the Adair family on Corley New Road, firing through a window at the back of the house. The UDA issued a statement the next day, claiming responsibility for the attack. Action will be taken against anyone providing guns or safe havens for these outcasts, the statement ominously warned. Meanwhile, in December of that year, Fat Jackie Thompson, one of Adair's top lieutenants, and who had helped smuggle a gun into the showdown with Gray back at Sandy Road, was attacked by a car bomb after driving over a speed bump near his new home in Bolton. Luckily for Thompson, only the detonator went off, and after seeing the remnants of the bomb on the road, he called the police. The Loyalist feud had well and truly spread across the Irish Sea to mainland Britain. Eventually released from prison in Ulster, a military helicopter flew Johnny Adair across the Irish Sea to Manchester, travelling by road considered too dangerous. He was quickly read the riot act by the GMP, who assured him any false moves would land him back in the slammer. Adair would go on to say, "I swapped HMP Maghabrew for HMP Bolton. It was a nightmare." Adair would eventually leave Bolton after marriage breakdown and settled in Ayrshire on the west coast of Scotland.
Have Britons lost the courage of the glorious days of yore? Have they lost the valiant spirit which their doughty fathers bore? They always travelled forward, shall we go tamely back? Shall we look on while the traitors they destroy our Union Jack? Shall we listen to the treason of sedition nurtured knaves, and condemn our loyal kindred to the fate of wretched slaves? Our fathers travelled forward, shall we go tamely back? Shall we look on while the traitors they destroy our Union Jack? Shall we be crushed like vermin beneath the Gladstone wheel, that he may live in story as the hero of repeal? Shall we no more go forward, but tamely travel back? Shall we look on while the traitors they destroy our Union Jack? He never shall surrender the glories of our past, but shoulder still to shoulder, protect them to the last. We must and shall go forward, we'll never travel back, and forever, aye forever, we shall hoist our Union Jack.
Loyalism is a complex culture which most in Britain do not understand. Like all cultures and ideologies, it inevitably has its extremes, which you can see manifested in the UDA's 1994 Doomsday Plan and the activities of Adair. Adair was too hot for the UDA to handle and had become a liability for them. He fitted this description from day one, but the UDA perhaps believed it was better for him to be within their ranks than outside of them, as evidenced by when he attempted to create his own splinter faction as well as his links to the LVF. The splits in the UDA can be compared in some ways to the splits in the IRA around the time the Troubles started, though they weren't as explosive as this split, which is perhaps one of the worst of its kind. Today, the UVF and UDA are often involved in organised crime, usually extortion, protection operations and the drugs trade. However, have no doubts about it, if the time comes when the status quo of their communities in Ulster are threatened, these organisations will become just as explosive as they were before. As one North Belfast UVF mural states, the UVF, UDA and other loyalist factions are prepared for peace, but ready for war.